Hi, my name is Emma Davidson, and this is an outline for my drugs and behavior class, working on Chapter 7, depressant and inhalants, and I did an outline for pages 144 to 149. So starting off with the history and pharmacology, we're talking about before barbiturates. The book starts off with talking about chloral hydrate, and I noted that in the early 1900s, a Chicago bartender named Mickey Finn became briefly famous when he was prosecuted for adding chloral hydrate to the drinks of some of his consumers. Um, after which they would become incapacitated and be robbed by one of his house girls. The term Mickey Finn entered our language as a slang for a drug added to someone's drink without his or her knowledge. Um, Chloral hydrate is also a gastric irritant, and repeated use can cause considerable stomach upset. Um, Moving on to paraldehyde, it was synthesized in 1829 and introduced clinically in 1882. Paraldehyde would probably be in a great use today because of its effectiveness as a CNS depressant with little respiratory depression and a wide safety margin. However, it doesn't work for one characteristic. It has an extremely noxious taste and an odor that permeates the breath of the user. Its safety margin and its ability to sedate patients led to widespread use in mental hospitals before the 1950s. And then I started reading into barbiturates. Although the barbiturates have largely been replaced by more modern drugs, they were the first CNS depressant prescription medications to be widely used and abused. Moving on, it was first introduced in 1903. The barbiturates became so important that eventually over 2,500 different examples of this chemical class were synthesized. The barbiturates are grouped according to their duration of action, which is something I took note of. And duration of action is how long a drug's effects last. So exactly what it sounds like. It also corresponds to how quickly they act after being taken orally. The short-acting barbiturates begin to produce effects in as little as 15 minutes and have effects lasting only 2 or 3 hours, whereas the long-acting drugs may take an hour to produce effects, but they may last for 8 hours or more. When these drugs were used during the daytime to reduce nervousness and anxiety, low doses of a long-acting barbiturate like phenobarbital were widely prescribed as sedatives. And although the majority of people who took these medications did so without harm, the barbiturates were associated with overdose deaths, both accidental and intentional. There was concerns for overdose, psychological dependence, and physical dependence led to bad reputation for all barbiturates. And in the 1950s, the door was wide open for a safer option. This led to, I don't really know how to say this, but meprovimate, which was patented in 1952 and was believed to be a new and unique type of CNS depressant. The FDA approved its use in 1955, and it quickly became widely prescribed based partly on a successful publicity campaign and partly on physicians' concerns about prescribing barbiturates. And then in 1970, meprovimate became for a scheduled for controlled substance. Benzodiazepines largely replaced it. And then moving on to methaqualone. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these right, but going along with my outline, with continued reports of overdoses and physical dependence associated with sacubitril and amarbitol, sleeping pills in the 1960s, the market was wide open for a hypnotic that would be less dangerous, which led to methaqualone. And it was synthesized in India and found to have sedative properties. Germany introduced it as an over-the-counter drug in the 1960s and had its first reported methaqualone suicide in 1962 and discovered that 10 to 20% of the drug overdoses in the early 1960s resulted from misuse of methaqualone. Germany changed the drug to prescription-only status in 1963, and from 1960 to 64, Japan also had a problem with methaqualone abuse, which was the culprit in more than 40% of drug overdoses in that country. Sorry. moving on, apparently no one in the United States was paying attention to these problems in other countries because in 1965, after 3 years of testing, Quaalude and Soper's brand names for methaqualone were introduced in the United States as prescription drugs with a package insert that read addiction potential not established. Um, in the 70s, ludes and soapers were familiar terms in the drug culture. Physicians were overprescribing a hypnotic drug that they believed to be safer than the barbiturates. Sales zoomed, and front pages reporting of its effects when misused helped to build its reputation as a drug of abuse. And in 1973, 8 years after it was introduced into the country, 4 years after American scientists began saying it produces dependence, and 11 years after the first suicide, methaqualone was put on Schedule 2. Um, so from that, we start talking about benzodiazepines. Um, the first of the benzodiazepines was chlorodiazepoxide, which was marketed under the trade name Librium, possibly because it liberates one from anxieties. Librium was marketed in 1960 as a more selective anti-anxiety agent that produced less drowsiness than the barbiturates and had a much larger safety margin before overdose death occurred in animals. Clinical practice bore this out. Physical dependence was almost unheard of, and overdose seemed not to occur except in combination with alcohol or other depressant drugs. um, as these drugs became widely used, reports of psychological dependence, occasional physical dependence, and overdose deaths appeared once again. Which I took note of here. Physiological dependence, the big issue and how much one takes and at the time of taking the drug. Overdose deaths are more likely when a drug is sold in higher doses, such as those prescribed for hypnotic drugs. Then the book starts talking about psychological dependence, which develops most rapidly when the drug hits the brain quickly, which is why intravenous use of heroin produces more dependence than oral use, and why smoking crack produces more dependence than chewing coca leaves. Then the book begins talking about physical dependence, which occurs when the drug leaves the system more rapidly than the body can adapt. One way to reduce the severity of the withdrawal symptoms is to reduce the dose of a drug slowly over time. Drugs with a shorter duration of action leave the system quickly and are much more likely to produce withdrawal symptoms than a longer acting drug. So in the 90s, they introduced the version of the Mickey. Chlorodiazepoxide was sold in low doses for daytime use and has a slow onset of action and even a longer duration of action. In the 90s, a new version of the Mickey Fin was popularized, and it was called Rohypnol, which was a benzodiazepine sold as a hypnotic in many countries around the world, but not in the United States. And it hit the news when reports surfaced of its being put into the drinks of unsuspecting women by their dates. The combination of Rohypnol and alcohol was reputed to produce a profound intoxication during which the woman would be highly suggestible and unable to remember what happened to her. In reality, Rohypnol effects are not much different from the effects of other benzodiazepines or any other CNS depressants when combined with alcohol, but popular folklore quickly established it as a date rape drug. And then closing out on page 148 to 149, talking about non-benzodiazepine hypnotics. The most recent addition to the class of depressant drugs do not have the chemical structure of the benzodiazepines, but they have similar effects. For example, zolpidem, which is also Ambien, was introduced in 1993, followed later by Zaloplan, which is Sonata, and Ezopiclone, also called Lunesta. Zopiclone is a close relative of Ezopiclone. I don't even know if I'm saying any of these right. Is available in Canada and the United Kingdom, but not in the United States. Since they all began with the same letter, they are often informally referred to as Z drugs. Ambien quickly became the most widely prescribed hypnotic drug on the market. And it has been shown to help induce sleep, but because of its short duration, users didn't always remain asleep for 7 to 8 hours. This rapid short action led to the introduction of an extended release version, Ambien CR, to maintain longer sleep. However, taking advantage of the rapid onset in 2011, the FDA approved a sublingual tablet, also called Intermezzo, to be taken when people awaken in the middle of the night. And although many intentionally hoped that non-benzodiazepines would be more specific and avoid some of the problems of earlier drugs, there have been reports of withdrawal reactions and other complications with them as well. They are listed along with the benzodiazepines in Schedule 4, one step below the Schedule 3 classifications of the barbiturates. So that's my outline for Chapter 7, and from page 144 to 149. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.